Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the course of Communication Skills. Dear students, this is lecture number 15 and today I am going to give you a presentation on types of listening. My name is Muhammad Asif Khan, lecturer, Department of English, Kohat University of Science and Technology. Now let's move toward the agenda for today's lesson. In today's lecture, we are going to discuss types of listening. I have given you a brief introduction about the types of listening in the last lecture, and today we will study the types of listening according to the purpose of listening. So in this lesson, first of all, I will describe to you discriminative listening. Secondly, I will explain the concept of comprehensive listening. Then we will look at critical listening. After that, we will take a look at biased listening. And then we will talk about evaluative listening, and the further types are appreciative listening, sympathetic listening, therapeutic listening, dialogic listening, and finally we will examine the relationship listening. So these are the types which we are going to discuss in this very lesson. Dear students, let's move towards the first type of listening, that is discriminative listening. This is the most fundamental kind of listening, and we see that in this type the difference between the different sounds which we are hearing is identified. If you cannot identify the difference between different sounds, then you cannot make sense of the meanings that is expressed by such differences. It means it is that basic type of listening in which we identify the difference between different sounds. So what we do, we learn to discriminate between different sounds within our language. That is the first stage, and later on we discriminate between the different phonemes that are from the other languages. So if we are unable to do that very thing in our own language or in some foreign language, then we will not be able to listen properly, and we will not be in that position to grasp or understand the real message of the sender. So this is the one reason why a person from the countries to which we belong finds it difficult to speak another language perfectly, as they are unable to distinguish, and they are not in position that they can recognize those subtle sounds that are required in that very language. So for that reason, discriminative language is very necessary. Now we look at another aspect of discriminative listening, that is if a person who cannot hear that subtleties of emotional variations in another person's voice, he will be less likely to be able to distinguish the emotions the other person is experiencing. So understanding and discriminating the emotional variations of a person, of a speaker, is very important. If the listener is not having that very ability or capability, so he is not going to discriminate between those real meanings which the sender wants to communicate to the receiver. Now I am going to give you the basic concept of the discriminative listening, and that is that listening is a visual as well as auditory act. Listening is not simply an auditory act, it is a visual plus auditory act. When we are communicating, we communicate much through body language. We thus need to be able to discriminate between the muscles and the skeletal movements that signify different meanings. Therefore, it is very important, very important to judge those minute expressions and emotional variations. Now, let's move towards second type of listening, that is comprehensive listening. The next step beyond distinguishing between different sounds and the sights is to make sense of them. That is the second step, that we understand that very message. So to comprehend the meanings from the sounds, we require following things. Like we need to have a lexicon of words at our fingertips. We should have the understanding of all the rules of the grammar, and we should have the knowledge of the syntax of that very language, by which it will be very easy for us to understand what the other person is talking to us. The same is true, of course, for the visual components of the communication and an understanding of the body language. Same is true. If you are not having the understanding of the components of the body language, you will not be able to understand the true emotional message that he is communicating to you. So, comprehensive listening helps us understand what the other person is really meaning. What is the real meaning he wants to narrate to us. If we look at comprehensive listening from another aspect, that is that in communication, some words are more important and some are less. When you listen to the talk of some speaker, some words are more important and some are less important. So comprehensive listening benefits from extraction of the key facts and items from the whole discussion. So comprehensive listening is known as content listening, informative listening, that is full listening. These are the other names of comprehensive listening, that what we are doing, we are listening to the contents, we are listening to the information that is being conveyed to us, and by doing this we are full listening. Now we will look at the third type of listening, that is critical listening. And critical listening is basically the listening for evaluating and judging or forming opinion about what is being said, or it is overall judgment that includes assessing the strength and weaknesses and agreements or disapprovals within that very talk. So this form of listening requires significant real-time cognitive efforts, because we see that in this type of listening, the listener analyzes what is being said and he relates that very thing to the existing knowledge and rules to which he is already well aware. While simultaneously we see that listening to the ongoing words from the speaker, that is continuous process. He is listening and doing all these things, evaluating and judging, forming opinions about that very thing, and further assessing the plus and negative points of that very talk. So he is doing all these things within that limited span of time. So that is critical listening. Now we will look at biased listening, And this type of listening happens when the individual or the receiver, he only hears what he wants to hear. So that is the partiality that is attached to this type of listening. So listener is when he is listening with the biases or prejudice, the pre-established concepts in his mind. Actually he is prone to misinterpret what the other person is saying, because all these things will be based on the stereotypes and the biases that he has. So biased listening is very often listed as evaluative type of listening in nature. That is, if we categorize this listening, we can categorize biased listening as evaluative listening in nature. Now we move toward that type which I mentioned in the last slide, that is evaluative listening. So in evaluative listening, the listener is trying to assess the truth of what is being said. And the second thing is that he makes judgments about what the other person is saying. So he is judging what the speaker is saying against our values, and he assesses that very talk or that very communication as good or bad, or worthy one or unworthy one. So evaluative listening is that type of listening in which the listener evaluates, he judges, and he assesses the truth of what is being said. Now let's move to the further explanation of evaluative listening, and we see that this type of listening is important when the other person is trying to persuade us. At that time, this very type of listening is very important. Perhaps if someone wants to change your behaviors, maybe even to change our beliefs, and he is trying to persuade us to frame and to formulate new beliefs and new behaviors, at that time evaluative listening is very important. Because within this type of listening, we discriminate between those subtleties of the language from which we comprehend the inner meanings of what is being said. So what we do in evaluative listening, we weigh the pros and cons of an argument, and we determine whether it makes sense logically, whether it is helpful to us or not. So in evaluative listening, we are judging that the person who is trying to persuade us, whether his talk is worthy or unworthy for us. Evaluative listening is also called as critical, judgmental, or interpretive listening. Now we will look at appreciative listening. In appreciative listening, we try to dig out certain information. For example, information which helps us to meet our needs and goals. So what we do when we are doing appreciative listening, we are trying to search out that information that meets our needs and goals, and it is that type of listening which fulfills the demands. For example, now I will give you one or two examples that when we are doing appreciative listening. For example, when we are listening to good music, actually we are doing appreciative listening, because that very listening is fulfilling the needs, inner needs of that very person at that time. Second type is that when you are listening to some excellent poetry. So when you are doing that, what that poetry is doing, actually that poetry is fulfilling the inner needs of that person. These very types of listening are appreciative listening. For example, if you are listening to the words or the speech of some great leader, and the motivation you are getting from that very great leader, that is appreciative listening. Dear students, now we will examine another type of listening, and that is sympathetic listening. In sympathetic listening, we care about the other person. Actually, the person who is listening and he is using sympathetic listening, he is having concern to that person to whom he is listening. So when we are doing sympathetic listening, we pay close attention and we express our sorrows for their ills, and we show happiness at their joys. So that type of listening is basically sympathetic listening, when we are paying close attention to the sorrows and happiness of the other person whom we cares about. That is sympathetic listening. Now let's look at therapeutic listening. And we see that in therapeutic listening, the listener has the aim not only to identify another person's feelings or sympathize with that very person or empathizing with the speaker, but he is trying to use that real connection with the speaker in order to help the speaker, because he is trying to understand the inner meanings of that person, and he change or develop that very thing in some way. So actually in therapeutic listening, the listener is trying to deepen that connection, and he tries to understand the inner feelings of that very individual, and actually he is not persuading that person, but he is just sympathizing with that very person, and he is trying to develop that connection with the speaker. So let's look at some other aspects of therapeutic listening, and we see that this type of listening not only happens when you go and see a therapist, but also we see that in many situations, the practical situations which we come across, where friends and family members, they try to find out the real issues just from listening the problems of that very individual. And we also see that this type of listening help the speaker to cure themselves, perhaps by some of cathartic process. We see that family members and the friends, they diagnose the real issues of the speaker, and they help them by addressing those very issues. So this type of listening also works in situations where we see that managers or the HR people or trainers or coaches, they attempt or they strive to help employees by learning their real issues and by developing that connection with them. So that is that therapeutic type of listening, which is very important type of listening. Now let's move toward another type of listening, and that is another very interesting type of listening, and that is dialogic listening. And the word dialogue, that stems from the Greek word dia, which means through, and logos means words. Thus dialogic means learning through conversation. So what we are doing, we are learning through conversation. So that gave us the importance of the listening, because if you are not listening what the speaker is talking to you, the process of conversation will be incomplete. And the second thing in dialogic listening is that dialogic listening means an engaged interchange of ideas and information, because as I described to you in the first line, that it is learning through conversation, Basically, we are interchanging ideas and information in this type of listening. So we actively try to learn something about the person and how they think in this very type of listening. Dialogic listening is sometimes also known as relational listening, and now I will explain this very thing into another type of listening, that is relationship listening. We see that the most important and the key factor in listening is to develop or sustain a relationship. When you are listening to someone, what we are doing, either we are developing relation or we are trying to sustain that relationship. For example, if two people are talking to one another and they are closely connected to one another, you will see that they will talk for hours and attend closely to each other and just listening what the other person is talking to him, and they will be happy in that conversation, and there will be nothing like the element of boredom or the feeling of weariness. You will see that both of them will be very fresh. The same words from someone else would seem to be very boring. If you are not having the right relation with that person, I guarantee you that when you will listen the same conversation from some other speaker, you will feel bored. But if you are having a good relation, then you will see that there will be no such type of exhaustion or fatigue or boredom or tiredness or weariness in that very discussion or conversation. So this type of listening is very important, especially in negotiations and sales. If you are negotiating with someone or when you're on a sales mission, if you are not listening to the speaker and you are not able to develop that relation, or if you already have relation with them and you are not able to sustain that relationship, I guarantee you that you will be a big failure. So it is very helpful if the person with whom you are talking or the person who is talking to you, he likes you and trusts you. I guarantee you that this type of listening will happen. Now this is the whole discussion, and today's lecture we have covered different types of listening, starting from the discriminative listening, and then we studied the comprehensive listening, critical listening, biased listening, evaluative listening, appreciative, sympathetic, and therapeutic listening, dialogic listening, and in the end I told you about the relationship listening. All these types are based on the purpose of listening, that what is the purpose of listening, and I categorize and listed all these types on that basis. When you have the knowledge of the types of listening, you can further develop your relationship, and the most important thing, that you will be very effective in your communication and conversation. So thank you very much for listening passionately, and see you in the next lecture. Allah Hafiz.